Welcome. You're here now. That means, wherever you've come from today, however heavy your body feels, however busy or loud your world has been, you've made it to this quiet space. Here, we tell stories slowly, stories of the people history forgot. Not kings, not warriors, not saints, but the workers, the cleaners, the invisible. Tonight's story stinks, literally. But before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, take a breath. Imagine the hush of a medieval town just before sunrise. No traffic, no electricity, just the slow, cold shuffle of wooden clogs on cobblestones and the slosh, slosh, slosh of a heavy bucket. It's a sound that meant one thing. The night soil man was making his rounds. This is the story of one of the most thankless, revolting, and socially shunned jobs in medieval life, the latrine cleaner. We don't know most of their names. We barely know how they lived, but we know what they did. They climbed down into cesspits. They shoveled out human waste. They hauled it away by the bucketful, and they did it every night while the rest of the world tried not to gag at the thought. And yet, without them, entire cities would have choked on their own filth, while nobles feasted above. It was the latrine cleaner who kept the ground beneath them from becoming a disease-ridden swamp. He didn't wear armor. He didn't carry a sword, but he fought an invisible war against rot, against decay, against the waste of thousands. This job was not only disgusting, it was dangerous, and still, it was essential. And that's something we often forget, how history wasn't just made by those who built kingdoms, it was also built by those who emptied their privies. Tonight, we'll descend into the hidden world of these medieval waste workers, what they wore, how they smelled, what they ate, what they feared, and how, despite doing the job no one wanted, they kept civilization from collapsing under the weight of itself. This isn't a story of glory. It's a story of grit, of sludge, of cold hands and silent dignity. And maybe, just maybe, it's a reminder that not all heroes ride on horseback. Some carry a bucket. So settle in. Adjust your pillow. Let your eyelids grow heavy as we begin this strange, slow, stinking journey into the past. You're safe here. You don't have to clean anything. Just listen and drift. We'll begin. After this short breath, the air is damp, not cold, just thick, heavy, with a sour kind of warmth that clings to the back of your throat. It's still dark outside, but you can hear something sloshing, not water, something heavier, muddier, a wet weight moving in rhythm. Slosh, slosh, pause, slosh, slosh, pause. There's a figure in the distance. He walks alone, shoulders hunched forward, head down, hands gripping the handles of two large wooden buckets that sway with every step. You hear his breathing. Not panicked, not hurried, just steady. The kind of breathing that comes from someone who has done this too many times to count. This is not a romantic medieval moment. There are no shining knights, no chivalry, no church bells, just a man with a bucket full of human waste, and he's only halfway through his route. He stops suddenly, not because he wants to, but because someone above didn't give him a warning. A window creaks open, and before he can even look up, it happens. A splash, warm, unmistakable, a chamber pot dumped from the second story, and some of it caught him. Again, he doesn't curse. He doesn't even flinch. Just wipes his face with a rag that's already soiled, and keeps moving, because that's the job. He is a latrine cleaner, also known as a gong farmer, or the night soil man, one of the most invisible, indispensable people in medieval society. No one wants to make eye contact with him. No one wants to shake his hand. Children are told to stay away, as if the stench were contagious. And yet, if he doesn't do his job, the streets fill with rot, the water goes bad, and very soon after, the plague follows. But still, no parades, no recognition, no thank you. Just the endless buckets, the endless stink, and the endless nights. It's strange, isn't it, how the people most vital to keeping the world livable are often the ones we pretend aren't there. The latrine cleaner's life was filled with filth, but also with discipline. He had his roots, his tools, his timing, and he had to work quickly, quietly, and without error. One wrong step, and he could fall into a pit himself. And if that sounds like an exaggeration, it's not. There are records, sparse but chilling, of workers who slipped while cleaning cesspits and drowned before anyone could pull them out. Some suffocated from the fumes alone. Others were buried alive in the very thing they spent their lives removing. No funeral, no eulogy, just another body in the muck. So, tonight, we remember them. Not with fanfare, not with pity, but with presence, with quiet acknowledgement, with the small dignity of storytelling, because that's what history rarely gives people like him. A story. So now, let's tell it properly. Let's walk through his tools, his clothes, his nightmares, and his place in the city that needed him, even if it never said so. Let's peel back the lid, gently, slowly, on the lives of those who worked in shadow, under the weight of shame, and carried buckets of humanity's least glamorous truth. This is the miserable job of a medieval latrine cleaner, and it begins right now. Close your eyes if you like. You won't need them where we're going. We're heading underground. You might think that waste management is a modern profession, something that emerged with modern plumbing and sprawling cities. But you'd be wrong, because as long as people have gathered in numbers, they've needed a way to deal with what their bodies leave behind. And in medieval times, that problem was as pungent and pressing as ever. Enter the latrine cleaner. They had many names. Gong farmer in England, fossword in some towns. In France, vidanger or emptier, and across Central Europe, variations of nightmen, pit diggers, and dung bearers. But no matter the name, the job was the same. Shovel human waste out of pits, barrels, streets, and privy holes, and carry it away. Let's pause there, because when we talk about latrines in medieval times, we're not imagining rows of pristine white porcelain or tiled public facilities. No, in most cases, it was just a hole. Sometimes it was over a stream. Sometimes it was in a wooden shack. Sometimes it was an actual room, a guardrobe perched above a chute that led down to a cesspit. But no matter how grand or humble, it all ended the same way. A slow, stinking accumulation of waste that someone had to remove. And that someone was the latrine cleaner. Unlike most tradespeople, they did their work almost exclusively at night. Why? Because it was quieter, because it was safer, because people didn't want to see them. They were, quite literally, invisible laborers, encouraged to operate in the darkness, both for their own safety and for everyone else's comfort. By law, many towns required that cesspits be emptied during the hours when the streets were clear, and if the workers were seen or smelled during the day, they could be fined or punished. Imagine that, being punished not for doing a bad job, but simply for being noticed while doing it. Their routes were often mapped out by town officials. They had assigned districts. They would visit known privy sites, empty the contents by hand or shovel into large buckets, then haul the waste out of town. And where did all that filth go? Sometimes it was dumped into rivers, a temporary fix that led to other problems. Sometimes it was buried in deep pits on the edge of town. But surprisingly, it was often sold. Yes, human waste had value. To farmers. You see, waste, or night soil as it was politely called, made for effective fertilizer. And in an age where nothing could go to waste, even the worst-smelling substances had a price. So, some latrine cleaners struck deals with rural landowners. They would haul buckets of collected waste outside city walls and dump them into carts, where farmers would purchase the foul mixture for their fields. The waste of thousands turned into the nourishment of crops, a grotesque but oddly poetic cycle of medieval ecology. Still, this didn't make them respected. If anything, the fact that they profited from waste made them even more detested. They were seen as necessary, but greedy, helpful, but repulsive, a contradiction that would follow them for life. And yet, without them, cities would collapse into disease and despair. In places like London, York, and Bruges, the presence of latrine cleaners allowed medieval urban life to function, barely, but function nonetheless. And when the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, it became tragically clear what happened when waste went unmanaged. Filth bred fleas, fleas spread plague, and death followed behind, swift and unforgiving. Some towns even increased pay for latrine cleaners during plague outbreaks, not out of generosity, but desperation. Still, most latrine workers lived on the margins. Low pay, no protection, little respect. And very rarely, someone born into this trade managed to rise above it, to escape, to become a tradesman, a land worker, or even a tavern keeper. But for the majority, the job of latrine cleaning was a lifelong sentence, passed from father to son, or given to those too poor, too desperate, or too broken to refuse. It wasn't a calling. It was survival. And when you think about it that way, you begin to see the quiet bravery in the work. Not heroic, perhaps, not noble in the chivalric sense, but deeply, bodily human. To enter a pit, to inhale rot, to haul weight so foul it could make the strongest gag, and still do it again the next night. That takes something. That takes strength, the kind of strength no poem ever celebrates. But that every city, every kingdom, every civilization depends on. So now, with that picture in mind, the shadows, the silence, the stench, let's descend a little deeper. Let's see what these men carried with them, not in their hearts, but in their hands. Buckets, hooks, scrapers, ropes, a toolkit unlike any other. And that is where we'll go next. Let's picture him again. It's an hour before sunrise. The streets are still dark, lit only by the soft flicker of a handheld lantern. You can hear the distant snoring of the city's wealthier inhabitants behind shuttered windows. But below the surface, in shadowy alleys, behind outhouses, beneath trapdoors, the latrine cleaner is already at work. And he's not empty-handed. He carries a collection of tools, crude, simple, but necessary. Not weapons, not instruments of music or trade, but the kinds of things you need when your job takes you into the belly of the city, where the filth waits. First, the buckets. Wooden, iron-rimmed, bound with thick rope or leather handles. They had to be sturdy. They had to hold weight, sometimes over 50 pounds of thick, sludgy waste. And they had to be balanced, one in each hand, so nothing spilled too early or too loudly. Then there were scrapers. These were long wooden paddles, often carved by the workers themselves. Some looked like oars, others more like flat spatulas. They were used to scoop the stubborn waste clinging to the stone walls of cesspits, hardened over time into thick tar-like layers. You couldn't just shovel it, you had to peel it. Sometimes inch by inch. Rakes were used to push larger waste clumps toward the bucket. If that image makes you wince, you're not alone. The workers often wore cloth over their mouths. Not to avoid disease. They didn't know about bacteria yet, but just to dull the smell. Next came hooks. Long iron ones, sometimes bent at the ends. These weren't elegant tools. They looked more like fire pokers or butcher's tongs, used to lift, stab, or reposition larger, solid objects that somehow made their way into the pit. Bones, rags, scraps of wood. Every now and then, something more surprising. Then, there were lanterns. A latrine cleaner's worst enemy wasn't always the smell. It was the dark. Many cesspits were underground. Some required descending into narrow shafts barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. A dropped lantern meant instant blackness, and blackness meant danger. So many workers tied their lanterns to belts, or nailed small candles to a piece of board they could hang around their neck like a shelf. A small flame in a sea of rot. They also carried ropes, not just for hauling buckets up and down, but for lowering themselves into pits too deep to reach otherwise. These ropes were rarely new, often frayed, sometimes damp, tied around the waist, looped over a beam, with a partner above holding the slack. If there was a partner. Many worked alone. As for clothing, there was no uniform. just layers of old, worn fabric, tunics that had already outlived their usefulness. Some wrapped rags around their arms or ankles to keep insects from crawling in. Others wore hoods to try, unsuccessfully, to keep the stench out of their hair. Gloves were a luxury. Most just used calloused, bare hands. Hands that no one wanted to touch later. In winter, their clothing froze stiff with waste. In summer, it soaked through, and always, they carried a stick or staff, not just for walking, but for poking at suspicious ground. Cesspits, when left unclean too long, could grow deceptive crusts. They looked solid, but step too hard, and you'd sink straight through, into something no one wanted to imagine. This staff became a symbol, not of authority, but of survival. Some towns required latrine cleaners to wear a badge or color to identify them, not for honor, but so citizens could avoid them. If you saw someone walking down the road with a crooked back, dragging 2 buckets, reeking from 50 paces away, you gave them space, not out of kindness, but revulsion. And yet, the work had its rhythm. They'd arrive at a cesspit or privy, check the weight of the waste. They'd listen for rats, because where there was waste, there were always rats. Then they'd lower their buckets, scoop, scrape, fill, and haul. Sometimes it took 1 trip, sometimes 10, sometimes all night. And if the pit was deep and required climbing in, they tied a rope around their chest, lowered themselves into the abyss, and hoped the sides wouldn't collapse. There was no applause, no payment upon completion. Most were paid weekly or monthly by the city or landowner. A few were paid in food or shelter or silence. When the job was done, they'd pour vinegar or herbs over their hands, a weak attempt at disinfection. Some burned sage, others chewed strong mint or cloves, just to keep from vomiting. And then, they'd disappear. Before the sun came up, before the noblewoman opened her window, before the city remembered who they were. Their tools were stored in sheds on the city's edge, locked up, out of sight, out of smell, but each tool told a story. A bucket with a cracked rim, patched with tar and stubbornness, a scraper worn down to a nub, a lantern blackened with smoke and soot. They were grimy heirlooms, handed down, passed on. Because latrine cleaning was rarely a job one chose. It was a job inherited, forced, accepted with resignation, not ambition. And yet, these tools kept the city clean, not polished, not sterile, but livable. They were the backbone of basic sanitation, before plumbing, before sewers, before science even understood what filth could carry. They were the first, last, and only defense between humanity and its own excrement. Tools of quiet courage, tools of forgotten dignity. So now that we know what they carried in their hands, let's talk about what they carried on their backs. A stench, a reputation, and a shame that no amount of vinegar could wash off. Because in the next chapter, we'll step into the social world of the latrine cleaner, and it is not kind. You could smell him before you saw him. That was the first thing. Long before a latrine cleaner turned the corner or stepped into the edge of a street, the air would begin to shift. Not violently, not suddenly, just a slow, creeping heaviness, like the scent of something sour fermenting under floorboards, like rot left in the sun, like the back corner of a forgotten barn. It clung to the wind, to wood, to wool, and worst of all, to him. The smell was not just unpleasant, it was unforgiving. It soaked into every layer of fabric, into every strand of hair, into the folds behind ears, under nails, in the back of the throat. Even vinegar and herbs could only mask it for a moment. The scent would return, like a curse, as if the job had marked its worker permanently, and the townsfolk noticed. They didn't just cross the street when he walked by. They held their breath, covered their mouths, muttered to their children. Some even spat in his direction. Not out of cruelty, they would say, but out of superstition. As if somehow being near him made you unclean, and maybe they believed it did. You see, in the medieval mind, bad smells were not just disgusting, they were dangerous. The theory of miasma was widely accepted, the belief that foul air itself caused disease. So if you smelled bad, People thought you might carry death with you. That meant latrine cleaners weren't just unpleasant to be around. They were feared. They were refused entry into churches, especially smaller chapels. They weren't allowed to sit at communal meals or enter most shops during daytime. Some towns even passed laws requiring them to wear distinct clothing or tokens, a kind of warning label for the rest of society. And even when the work was done, the shame remained. They would walk home under cover of night, alone, sometimes stoned by local boys, sometimes cursed at by older women, sometimes followed by dogs, the only creatures that didn't seem to mind the smell. Marriage was difficult, almost impossible. Some latrine cleaners married only other outcasts, widows, foreigners, the poor upon the poor. And even then, the children born from such unions were marked by their father's work, mocked, avoided, pushed to the edges of schoolyards and marketplaces. The stigma ran deep, like a second skin, and it didn't wash off. Not with soap, not with time, not even with retirement. Former latrine cleaners who managed to scrape together savings and leave the work behind were still remembered for it. That's old Jaron, someone might whisper. Used to shovel filth down by the tanner's yard. Don't buy bread from his daughter. Shame, passed down like a surname. But here's the strange thing. Despite all that, despite the rejection and revulsion and ridicule, these men still got up each night, still hauled their buckets, still emptied the pits, still carried the stink so others didn't have to. Why? Because no one else would. There was no line of applicants, no pride in the profession, no hope for upward mobility, only the quiet knowledge that someone had to do it. And if it wasn't you, it might be no one. And if no one did it, the whole city would suffer. It's easy to judge from a distance, to wince and wrinkle your nose. But take a moment, just one moment, to imagine what it felt like to walk through your own neighborhood and be treated like a walking disease, to hear shutters slam, to hear prayers whispered under breaths, to watch people bless themselves as you passed, not because you were sacred, but because they wanted to keep you away, to carry shame like another full bucket. That is what latrine cleaners bore. Not just the physical weight of human waste, but the emotional weight of being seen as filth themselves. And yet, beneath the stink and the stigma, they were just men. Fathers, sons, workers trying to feed a family. Men with backs that ached, with cracked fingers, with blisters that never healed. Men who sometimes dreamed of different lives. Men who sometimes cried when no one was looking. History forgets them, because they were easy to ignore. Because no one built statues for the people who cleaned the streets. Because they were covered in the one thing society pretended didn't exist, its own waste. But tonight, we sit with them. We walk with them. We see what they carried, not just on their backs, but in their hearts. The isolation, the quiet strength, the dignity no one else saw. And now, as you begin to feel your own breath slow, as your eyes grow heavier, and the world around you fades, let's look a little deeper. Not into their souls, but into the dangers they faced every night. Because cleaning filth was not just thankless, it was life-threatening. Next, we descend into the cesspits themselves and see what waited for them down there in the dark. Let's go deeper now. Past the street, past the stink, down into the pit. Beneath the cities of medieval Europe was a world no one talked about, a world of rot, dark tunnels, soaking stone, and cold silence, a world not meant to be seen and rarely survived for long. This was the workplace of the latrine cleaner, and it was dangerous, not metaphorically, not socially, but physically, immediately, fatally, because when you climbed into a cesspit, you weren't just wading through filth. You were gambling with your life. Let's begin with the air. You see, waste, when left to ferment, releases gases. Not the kind you notice in passing, but the kind that suffocates slowly and silently. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, carbon dioxide. Invisible, heavier than air, they gathered in the low spaces, waiting, A worker could lower himself down a few feet, lantern in hand, and suddenly feel lightheaded, then dizzy, then gone. There are records, few but haunting, of latrine cleaners collapsing in pits, unconscious before they could even scream. Some were pulled out in time. Many were not. They suffocated, not from lack of courage, but from doing their job in the wrong place, at the wrong time, without even knowing the risk. And if the gases didn't kill you, the structure might. Cesspits, especially older ones, were often unstable, built into clay, lined with stone. But time and moisture eroded everything. Sometimes the walls caved in. Sometimes the floor gave way. Sometimes a worker, trying to scoop from the side, would lean too far, and the whole pit would collapse. Can you imagine? The silence of the early morning, a worker inside a pit, and then a sudden slurping sound, and then nothing. The waste didn't splash. It swallowed. And if someone was there to see it, to try to help, they'd often face the same fate. In some towns, it became illegal for more than one man to enter a pit at a time. Not for safety, but because officials didn't want to lose two workers to the same hole. Then there were the injuries. Cuts and scrapes were inevitable. Rusty tools, sharp stones, shards of bone or broken pottery hidden beneath the surface. The smallest cut could become infected. They had no antibiotics, no antiseptics, no rubber gloves, just open skin and waste. Many developed sores that never healed, fungal infections that spread up their legs, trench foot from standing too long in cold, wet conditions. Some limped for the rest of their lives. Others had limbs amputated, crudely, painfully, and often fatally, and still they kept working, because they had to. But perhaps the most haunting hazard wasn't the gas, or the collapse, or the infections. It was the fear of being forgotten. Imagine this. You take a job because there are no other choices. You crawl into a pit of filth because your family needs bread, and you never crawl back out. No one writes your name down. No one holds a funeral. No one even speaks of you, except in hushed embarrassment. Your body becomes part of the waste, and the city continues, clean, comfortable, and unaware. It happened. Not often, but enough. Enough for latrine cleaners to tell stories. Enough to keep new workers awake at night before their first descent. Enough to give every pit a name, a personality, a reputation. The one behind the butcher's yard eats people. The one near the old church spits back what you throw in. The one by the tanner's corner. Don't go alone. Superstition and survival became indistinguishable, because when you worked in the dark long enough, everything felt like it could kill you. And yet, strangely, there were rituals. Before a dangerous job, some latrine cleaners would mutter a prayer, not to saints, who rarely watched over them, but to the pit itself. Hold me today. I'll leave no mark. Let me out whole. Others touched a charm, a nail, a tooth, a coin tied to their belt. Small protections in a world that offered them none. And if they made it through the night, they would bathe. Not in water, which was precious, but in smoke, burning herbs, straw, pine needles, anything that would mask the stench. They would stand in the smoke, arms out, eyes closed, letting it wash over them. Not just for cleanliness, but for cleansing. Because in a world without soap, you cleaned what you could and tried to forget the rest. Some men went mad. The constant exposure to waste, to isolation, to trauma, slowly wore them down. They'd be seen talking to themselves, or wandering at night, long after the job was done, carrying empty buckets. Not because they had anywhere to go, but because they didn't know what to do without them. Others became hardened, silent, stone-faced. The job was their mask, and yet, through all of it, the city remained clean as it could be. Not because of a noble decree, not because of science, but because a few dozen men, every night, risked their lives to carry out the filth that no one else wanted to see. And now, centuries later, we speak of them, in whispers, in dreams, in chapters written slowly, carefully, like this one. So next time you flush a toilet, next time you pass a sewer grate, or smell something foul and wrinkle your nose, spare a thought, not of disgust, but of gratitude. Someone, once upon a time, faced far worse, so you wouldn't have to. Now, let us step back into the world above, but not yet into the light, because before we can fully understand the life of a latrine cleaner, we must see where they stood in society. Next is about reputation, rejection, and life on the edge, where the filth wasn't just physical, but social. Let's climb back up, now. Out of the pit, out of the dark, and into the narrow streets of the town, where the sun is rising and the city is waking, but not for him. He walks the opposite way, back toward the outskirts, back to where he came from, back to the edge. Because latrine cleaners didn't live in the heart of the city. They weren't allowed to. Their homes were built on the margins, near the gates, the marshes, or downwind from the markets, not by law, necessarily, but by pressure, by sideways glances, by wrinkled noses, by polite refusals to rent a room, by neighbors who made it clear, we don't want your kind here. And so, he lived on the edge. Not just geographically, but emotionally, socially, spiritually. He wasn't just poor. He wasn't just dirty. He was untouchable. In many towns, gong farmers were not welcome in taverns. They weren't served first in bread lines. Some weren't even allowed to worship in crowded cathedrals. The risk of their odor disrupting reverence, they said. They were made to wait, made to kneel in the back, made to feel less, even when they had money, and some did, in modest amounts. It couldn't buy them respect. Their coins were accepted, but not their presence, and this rejection followed them everywhere. In the marketplace, stall owners would step away when they approached. At festivals, they stood at the edge of the crowd. At town meetings, their votes, if allowed, were whispered and ignored. Children were warned about them. Don't get too close. You'll catch something. That's the man who carries buckets. He touches filth all day. Even when they weren't working, the reputation clung like the smell. Invisible, pervasive, unforgiving. And yet, most latrine cleaners weren't angry. Not outwardly. They didn't throw stones. They didn't raise fists. They simply lowered their eyes, stepped aside, and kept walking. Because what choice did they have? There was no ladder to climb, no promotion to earn, no manager of the waste division to impress. Their job was a circle, night, filth, rinse, repeat. So they lived simply, small cottages, shared fires, old tunics passed down through 3 sets of hands, bread hard enough to hammer a nail with, soups that were more water than vegetable. But in that simplicity, there was something else, a kind of quiet community, other outcasts, tanners, gravediggers, midwives accused of superstition, old women who muttered to themselves. They didn't sit together at feasts, but they nodded to each other in passing, shared a stew when one had extra, exchanged a dry piece of wood in winter, held space for one another, without judgment, because they knew. They knew what it felt like to be seen, but not acknowledged, to be needed, but never welcomed. And still, they laughed. Not often, not loudly, but sometimes, in the safety of their edge-of-town kitchens, they told stories, jokes about nobles and their delicate stomachs, tales of chamber pots dropped on the heads of unsuspecting monks, moments of absurdity, found even in the most miserable work. And sometimes, they dreamed of a better job, of a quiet plot of land, of a place where the smell didn't follow them like a curse. Few escaped, but some did. There are faint records, barely legible, of latrine workers who saved enough to buy a plot outside the city, to raise goats, to make soap, to live a life free from the pits. But even then, the past hung over them like a low fog. One former worker, long retired, was still referred to in city records as Matthew the Gong. Not Matthew the farmer, not Matthew the man, Just Doc, Matthew the Gong. Because for society, the label stuck longer than the job ever did, and that's what makes their life so tragic. Not just the danger, not just the smell, but the refusal to be seen, to labor without legacy, to be necessary but never embraced, to give the city its cleanliness and receive only filth in return. But here's the secret no one liked to admit. When plague struck, when bodies piled in the streets, when people fled their homes in fear, it was the latrine cleaner who stayed. He'd seen worse. He'd waded through the city's insides. He wasn't afraid of dirt or smell or death. He'd been living in its shadow all along. And in that moment, that terrible, dark, historical moment, he was no longer invisible. He was essential. He was called upon. And for once, briefly, he was respected. But only until the danger passed. Then the shutters closed, the noses wrinkled again, and the edge of the town called him back. History didn't build statues for these men, but without them, the foundations would have rotted. So now, as you rest, warm and clean, think of them, not with pity, but with quiet admiration. Because sometimes, the people who hold the city together aren't the ones on the throne, but the ones carrying the bucket. Now that we've seen where they stood in society, on the outskirts, behind the crowd, always in shadow, let's look at the city itself, how it was built, how waste was handled, and why this job was even necessary. Next, we explore the hidden engineering of medieval sanitation and the fragile systems that held it all together. Let's lift our eyes from the bucket and look at the city around it. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a medieval town, not the romantic version with flower carts and lute players, but the real one, living, breathing, sweating. Narrow streets, paved with uneven stone, timber-framed houses leaning inward, like tired old men, roofs of thatch and slate, clustered tightly together, people and animals, moving through shared spaces, chickens, dogs, goats, children, all walking the same paths. Now, imagine that city, without plumbing, no drains, no pipes, no manholes, no sewage system beneath your feet, only gravity and habit and hope. You see, medieval cities were not built with sanitation in mind. They were built for protection, for trade, for community, not for cleanliness. And that made managing human waste a constant, citywide crisis. Let's start with the basics. In most towns, the average household had a privy, a small wooden shack over a pit. If you were poor, it was shared with several families. If you were wealthier, it might be built into your home, often in the form of a guardrobe, a narrow chute dropping straight down to a cesspit below. Now think of that cesspit. It didn't drain, it didn't flush, it simply filled, slowly, steadily, year after year. And when it got full, it stank. And when it overflowed, it became everyone's problem. Some pits were shallow, dug quickly and covered with boards. Others were deep and lined with stone. Some were connected to crude trenches that led nowhere useful, just to the nearest low-lying ditch. And if rain came, it all flowed back, into the streets, into the wells, into the living. Now let's look at the streets themselves. Most had no central drain. A few, in wealthier cities, had a shallow gutter down the middle. But these gutters weren't built for sewage. They were for rainwater, and they were often clogged with slop, straw, and spoiled meat. Chamber pots were emptied directly into the street. Yes, from windows. People were expected to shout a warning before tossing waste. A quick cry of Gardyloo in Edinburgh, or something similar elsewhere, meant watch out below. But in truth, no one always waited. Sometimes it splashed onto stone, sometimes onto shoes. And so the streets grew slick, not with mud, but with the runoff of daily life. But even that wasn't the biggest problem. The real danger came from what couldn't be seen. Waste seeped into the ground, into cisterns, water barrels, public fountains, even into the shallow wells people used for drinking. People didn't understand bacteria, but they did understand when water tasted off. And when illness followed a few days later, they blamed spirits. They blamed sin. But rarely did they blame the cesspit 3 doors down. There were attempts, noble ones, to control the problem. City councils passed laws. Don't dump waste outside your neighbor's house. Don't allow pigs to roam freely through the market. Keep cesspits at least 6 feet from the town well. But enforcement was thin, and the waste kept coming. Some cities tried more innovative approaches. London, in the 14th century, began digging large public latrines known as privy houses, often built over rivers. People would pay a small fee to use them. These latrines were cleaned out monthly, or at least they were supposed to be. In Paris, wooden chutes were built to carry waste away from buildings, but they often dumped it straight into the Seine, which, of course, was also where people washed their clothes and drew their drinking water. Some monasteries were surprisingly advanced. They built running water systems, not for pleasure, but for practicality. Some even had multi-level latrines with running water from rain cisterns to carry waste away. A marvel of medieval engineering, and sadly, the exception. Because for the average person, there was no system. There was only repetition. Fill the pit, dump the pot, watch the street glisten, and hope the wind changed direction. And this is where the latrine cleaner comes back in. He was the patch, the bandage, the human stopgap holding the city together. When the pits got too full, when the smell was too strong, when the neighbors complained to the council, he was called. Down he went, with tools, with rope, with nothing but his body and the strength to endure. He was part of the city's invisible plumbing, not made of stone or clay or metal, but of flesh. He moved through narrow alleys at night, clearing the waste that no building could redirect. And even though the cities didn't recognize him as an engineer, that's exactly what he was. He understood the slope of a street, the depth of a pit, the flow of liquids on stone, the signs of gas buildup in sealed chambers. He wasn't a scholar. He wasn't a priest. But in his own quiet, grimy way, he was a master of fluid dynamics. Without him, cesspits burst, streets flooded, disease spread faster, children died sooner. So yes, medieval sanitation was primitive, messy, improvised, a citywide system of gut instinct and grim labor. But within that mess was rhythm, pattern, survival, and at the center of it was the latrine cleaner, unseen, uncelebrated, but holding back the tide. Now that we understand the world he worked in, the fragile, filthy network of city life, let's step into another space, the one between science and superstition, because next, we explore the strange beliefs medieval people held about human waste and the spiritual stain it left behind. Let's leave the streets now, step away from the gutters and the stink, and walk slowly toward the church. It's early morning. The bells haven't rung yet, but already you can hear the crows calling from the belfry. And behind the stone walls of the cathedral, candles are being lit. Voices are murmuring prayers. In the medieval world, faith touched everything, from illness to weather, birth to death. Life was framed in the language of sin, purity, and salvation. Cleanliness, therefore, was not just physical, it was spiritual. And filth, well, that was more than a nuisance. It was a threat to the soul. Let's take a step back. In many Christian teachings of the time, sin was often described in terms of filth. To be impure was to be unclean. To be holy was to be washed clean. Even the sacraments of the church used water, in baptism, in blessings, in rituals of forgiveness. And so, for the average medieval person, cleanliness became a kind of moral status. If you were clean, in body, clothing, and speech, you were closer to God. If you were dirty, you were suspect. Now, place the latrine cleaner into this framework. A man who, every day, waded through the filth of others, who was never clean, who reeked, who carried on his skin the waste of the city. To many, he wasn't just dirty, he was unholy. Not because he sinned more, but because he smelled like sin. Because his very presence reminded people of death, rot, and shame. He couldn't enter sacred spaces freely. In some parishes, he was made to sit at the back, or not enter at all. He wasn't offered the kiss of peace. Priests looked down at him from the pulpit, and occasionally spoke of men like him as symbolic of spiritual decay. It wasn't personal, it was theological. Even his job, removing filth, was seen by some as symbolic of hell's labor. There are writings, tucked away in medieval sermons and morality plays, that describe the devil's realm as a sewer, a place where the wicked were plunged into pits of excrement for their sins. And yet, the latrine cleaner did that job every night, not as punishment, but as service. Still, it changed how others looked at him. Superstition clung to him like a second layer of grime. Some believed that the stench of human waste carried demons, and that those who touched it were susceptible to possession. Others whispered that latrine cleaners saw things in the pits, ghosts, curses, forgotten sins made flesh. Stories passed between washerwomen and apprentices about a gong farmer who went mad after pulling up a bucket full of bones, or another who disappeared, dragged down by something not quite human. Whether believed or not, these stories stuck, and they reinforced the image. The latrine cleaner was closer to filth, and therefore further from God. But not all was rejection. In some corners of medieval thought, especially among the more mystical orders, there were those who believed that humility before God meant lowering oneself, even to filth. Some monks, in acts of extreme devotion, would volunteer to clean latrines, not often, not long, but enough to understand what it meant to be brought low. And a few spiritual texts even praised those who labored unseen in the service of the body. They argued that tending to the body's waste was a mirror of tending to the soul's sin. Both were messy, difficult, and thankless, but both were necessary for health. Still, those were rare voices. Most of the time, the latrine cleaner was left out of the religious conversation entirely. No saints bore the title. No hymns were written in his honor. No feast days celebrated the man who emptied the pit beneath the priory. He walked among churches, but remained outside their walls. And yet, in his own quiet way, the latrine cleaner performed a kind of sacred duty. He purified not the soul, but the space. He removed the waste, so others could worship without smelling it. He kept the holy places holy, even if they never let him inside. And maybe that was its own kind of devotion. Not sung, not praised, but persistent and deeply human. When we talk about purity, it's easy to think of white robes and soft hymns, but perhaps there's another kind, a kind that comes from doing necessary things, unseen, unwanted, but done anyway, because they must be. So the next time you walk into a clean space, a sanctuary, a chapel, a quiet corner of rest, remember, someone kept it that way, not with incense, not with blessings, but with a shovel. Let's return now to the latrine cleaner's small world. Not the church, not the city, but his home. In the next chapter, we'll enter his private life, what he ate, where he slept, and what his dreams might have looked like. It's time to go home now. The buckets have been emptied, the tools wiped. If only slightly, the air still clings to him, that sour, earthy film of the night's labor. But there's nothing more to be done, not until tomorrow. So he turns back, away from the city, toward the edge of town, and to the place he calls home. It isn't much. A single-room cottage. One window, half covered with linen. Walls of wattle and daub. A low thatched roof that sighs when it rains. A fire that rarely burns bright, but never quite dies. Inside, it smells of smoke and cabbage. And if he's lucky, bread. Not fresh bread. Not the soft, weedy kind from the baker's square, but a dense, dark loaf, hard around the edges, softened with broth or milk when available. The meal is simple, always. He eats what the poor eat, gruel, a thin porridge of barley or oats, cooked slowly over the fire, pottage, a stew of whatever could be found, turnips, leeks, a bone, if fortune allowed, onions, sometimes raw, sometimes roasted over coals, and if the gods smiled, a salted herring, traded for a favor, or a handful of herbs. He doesn't eat much, not because he's trying to save, but because his stomach, over the years, has grown cautious. After years of inhaling rot and disease, after nights spent in waist-deep filth, his body learned to ask for less. He drinks water, but carefully. Sometimes small beer, or a cup of sour ale, just enough to quiet the gut, to soften the edge of memory. He eats alone, unless he has a wife, and even then, silence is often the third guest at the table. It's not sadness. It's habit, exhaustion, the language of two people who've carried too much for too long. After supper, he removes his boots, stiff with use, worn through at the toes. He unwinds the cloth from his ankles, peels off layers of tunic and hose. Each garment carries the smell of labor. It fills the room, but he doesn't notice anymore. To him, it's not foul. It's familiar. And then he rests. His bed is a pile of straw, covered in a rough woolen blanket. Sometimes there's a pillow, stuffed with old rags or feathers that shift like ghosts in the night. He doesn't toss. He doesn't turn. He lies down and sinks, because no one sleeps deeper than the man who has carried the city's waste on his back. Not the merchant, not the priest, not even the nobleman on feather-stuffed linens. There's something about filth, something about carrying it, that drains the soul. And when the work is done, when the room grows quiet, his body doesn't just want rest. It demands it. But even in sleep, the mind stirs. A thick blackness, uninterrupted, like the bottom of a sealed pit. Other times, memory, falling into water, the sound of scraping stone, the feeling of rope slipping through gloved hands. But on rare nights, when the wind is quiet and the fire still glows, he dreams of other things, of open fields, untouched by waste, of a stream, clean enough to drink from without fear, of a market where no one turns away when he passes, of holding out a coin and being offered the freshest loaf with a smile, of being clean, not just in body, but in the eyes of others. He doesn't want riches or power or fine robes. He dreams of being ordinary, of walking through town without whispers, of being no one special and no one shunned. And sometimes, if he dares, he dreams of stopping, of never lifting another bucket, of hanging his scraper on the wall and letting it gather dust, of watching another man walk that long, dark road while he stays home. But those dreams are short, because morning always comes, and the pit does not wait, so he wakes, not with dread, not with joy, just with the steady resolve of someone who knows this is his life. And while it's not beautiful, and while it's not clean, it's his. He eats, he dresses, he lifts the bucket, and the cycle begins again. So as you lie in your own bed tonight, warm, clean, safe, remember this: the comfort of sleep was not always so easy, not always so sweet. For some, it was earned in grime. Dreams don't always come wrapped in silk. Sometimes they come in the shape of a stale loaf, a quiet room, and a morning where the pit does not overflow. Now, let's rise from his bed. Let's walk forward in time and listen to the voices of those who wrote about him. Next, we'll enter the records, where the complaints, fines, and rare flickers of praise paint a portrait of the latrine cleaner in ink. So far, we've wandered through shadows, through stink, through shame, through silence. But now we follow ink, because even the invisible sometimes leave footprints. And in the towns of medieval Europe, those footprints were often left in parchment, city records, tax rolls, court documents, minute entries from guild meetings and council logs, dry, factual, often tedious, but full of ghostly details. And tucked among these pages, you'll sometimes find a name, not carved in stone, but scratched in faded ink. A name like Willem de Pitt, or Thomas Gongfarmer, or simply the man who tends the privy behind the alderman's house. These weren't biographies. They were complaints, fines, petitions, expenses. In one town ledger from 1383, a note reads, 3 pence paid to the gong man for the emptying of the south chamber, after protest by neighbors. In another, Thomas was summoned for allowing the waste to overflow into the cobbled lane near the baker's stall. Even in death, the cleaner was often reduced to a problem, a task, a number. They were only remembered when something went wrong. A blocked pit, a smell that drifted too far, a pile left too long in the wrong alley. But within these complaints, there's something remarkable. They reveal the cleaner's presence, his necessity, his regularity, because if he hadn't been doing his job, he wouldn't be mentioned at all. Some entries describe him being summoned by town officials, especially before holy days, festivals, or visits from nobility. Ensure the west privies are cleared before the bishop's procession. The nightman to be paid upon completion. Others list him in expense columns. His work treated like street sweeping or chimney maintenance. To the gong farmer, 4 shillings for the pits behind St. Alard's. Rarely, very rarely, a kind word appears. One small parish in York wrote this in 1441. Of the man who cleans the drains, none complain. He works in quiet and does not disturb the worship. Not much, not a song, but in that stillness, you can feel it, acknowledgement. It's worth noting that many cleaners were not listed by full name. They were referred to by role, the man with buckets, the one from behind the baker's lane, or simply, the gong, as if they weren't men at all, just moving parts in the machinery of the town. Sometimes, they appeared in disputes, rival cleaners vying for territory, arguments over fees, claims of sabotage. One cleaner accusing another of dumping waste too close to his route. Even in that filth, there was competition, territory, turf, and where there's turf, there's power. Some cleaners formed loose cooperatives, 2 or 3 men pooling buckets, splitting earnings, and guarding each other in dangerous pits. There are hints, nothing firm, that in some cities, cleaners formed informal guilds. Not for honor, like the carpenters or smiths, but for safety, to control pricing, to divide work, to defend themselves against exploitation, because even the lowest workers knew there's strength in numbers, even when your hands are covered in filth. In a few rare cases, cleaners petitioned town councils. One such request, faded but legible, asked for sturdier gloves to be issued by the mayor's office. Another requested a cesspit map be updated after a cleaner fell into an unmarked shaft. There's no record of whether those requests were granted, but they asked, they dared to speak, and the ink remembers them. Some entries are stranger still. A note from Bruges in the late 1300s mentions, Ron night, man reported a pit containing bones of curious nature, sheriff to investigate. We don't know what those bones were. Animal? Human? Remnants of a crime? Or simply a discarded roast? The cleaner's name wasn't written, but his warning was. He saw something and said something, and once again, the record held it. But what's most moving are the glimpses of dignity, small lines that show the worker, not as a nuisance, but as someone respected, if only for a moment. Gong man paid early for diligence during plague. His service continued through winter frost, no complaint made. In those lines, we see the shape of the man behind the bucket, steady, reliable, reluctantly honored, and when the work was done, when age bent his spine and made the pits too deep to navigate, he faded from the records. Not because he stopped mattering, but because no one thought to write him down. Unless something went wrong, he disappeared, and yet his story remains. In fragments, in finds, in footnotes, because history, for all its noise, is often built from whispers, and sometimes that's enough. So now, let's return one final time to the man himself. Not at work, not in motion, but at the end. Next we speak of death, burial, and legacy, what was left behind and what was forgotten. Every job ends. Every pair of hands eventually grows too stiff to lift the bucket. Every man, even the most invisible, lays down his tools and does not rise again. So what happens when the latrine cleaner dies? There is no fanfare, no procession, no candlelit service in the nave, no children tossing flowers, no eulogy from the pulpit. Just a small note in the corner of a town ledger. Dranerid, deceased, position to be filled, if he was lucky. His body was wrapped in linen. If not, an old tunic. Burial might take place behind the churchyard wall, not within its boundaries. Perhaps in a common pit for the poor, perhaps in a shallow grave dug by a friend, another outcast, or his own apprentice. The priest might say a few words, or might not. The grave wouldn't be marked. There would be no headstone, just earth, soft, wet, indifferent, and above that earth, the town would continue. Chamber pots emptied, cesspits refilled. The stench, for a day or two, might seem worse, until someone else picked up the bucket, because that was the legacy, not remembrance, but replacement. The world didn't pause for him. It barely noticed. But should we? Let's pause here for just a moment. Let's remember what he carried. Not just the weight of waste, but the weight of being unwanted. The weight of being needed, but never thanked. He walked through alleys no one else entered. He faced dangers few understood. He protected the city with nothing but a scraper and a quiet resolve. And when he died, the only legacy he left behind was an empty bucket and the faint smell of the life he lived. But here's the part the records don't say. What he truly left behind. He left behind streets that didn't overflow, wells that didn't turn black, children that didn't sicken as quickly, bread that could be baked without the stench of rot at the doorstep, markets that could open at dawn, because the waste was already gone. He left behind the foundations of urban life, and yet the city was built without him in mind. He existed beneath the cobblestones, not just physically, but metaphorically, supporting the weight of the world while being ignored by it. And maybe that's why we tell his story now, not to pity him, not to sanctify him, but to finally see him. The latrine cleaner was not a saint, not a soldier, not a scholar. He was a man, a worker, a quiet part of the great machine. But without him, the machine would have stopped, the stink would have risen, the rats would have multiplied, and death would have arrived earlier, faster, darker. So when we speak of legacy, perhaps it's not in what we build, but in what we prevent, not in what we are praised for, but in what we quietly carry. He didn't leave behind a name carved in marble, but he left behind a cleaner path for someone else, and that is something. So tonight, as we close our eyes, as the world falls still, let us offer one small moment of silence for the man who cleaned the filth no one else would touch, not with pity, not with sadness, but with respect, because even the quietest lives deserve to be remembered. Even the dirtiest jobs leave behind a kind of sacredness, and even those buried in unmarked graves deserve to be spoken of with care. Thank you for walking this road with me. You may never carry a bucket, but we all carry burdens, and tonight, may yours feel a little lighter. Now rest, breathe, you're safe, and sleep is near. Now the story is finished. The buckets are empty, the tools are hung on their pegs, and the night, long, heavy, and unkind, has passed. All that remains is quiet. It's strange, isn't it? How we go looking through history for heroes, for kings and poets, warriors and saints, and walk right past the people who cleaned the streets those heroes marched on, the people who carried things so the rest of us didn't have to, the people who made the world bearable, but were never welcomed into the parts of it that mattered. The latrine cleaner didn't lead armies. He didn't write books. He didn't craft cathedrals or compose hymns. But every day, he kept the city standing. He prevented collapse, fended off decay, and quietly bore the burden of other people's waste. Physical, social, even spiritual. He was the kind of man who was never invited in, never sat at the long tables, never praised from the pulpit, and yet the world ran more smoothly because he existed. That is a different kind of power. Not loud, not visible, but enduring. So tonight, as you drift, let this story remain with you, not as something grim, but as something grounding. Let it remind you that dignity doesn't always wear a crown, that worth isn't measured in applause, and that sometimes the most important work in the world is the kind no one wants to do. Maybe you felt invisible too. Maybe you've carried burdens that others never thanked you for. Maybe you've cleaned up messes, literal or emotional, that weren't even yours. If so, then in some small way, you've walked beside the latrine cleaner, and like him, you matter, even when no one says so. Especially then, let your breath slow now. Let your shoulders drop. The fire has gone out. The tools are still. The city sleeps. And so should you. Good night, unseen worker. Good night, forgotten cleaner. Good night to the ones who carried what others couldn't. You are not alone. You are not forgotten. You are home.